What is the measurement of mediation experiment all about? The name is long, it sounds scary. The answer is it's a very interesting and very simple type of experiment because what it comes down to is whether you have or you do not have a mediator. I will use an example from a published academic paper. I'm not promoting this journal, I'm not promoting this paper. This is simply an example from my own readership of academic literature, where I'm using them as examples to show you what the measurement of mediation experiment is all about. If you have watched previous videos on this channel, you would have noticed that this was the schematic or the visualization for the experiment that I used. I used to show independent variable on the left-hand side. The arrow designates the effect or the impact. The second bubble was actually the dependent variable, whatever that you were measuring, whether it was perception, whether it was knowledge, whether it was attitudes, or whether it was behavioral outcome or intentions to engage in behavior. Now, when it comes to the measurement of mediation design, the visualization of the experiment would be very different because now in between the dependent variable and the actual intervention manipulation that you're executing, there is a mediator. So it's like this connecting thing between your intervention and the dependent variable that you're measuring. Now on this screen, as a dependent variable, I have an example of behavior, and in red color, I just called my interventions the stimuli. Now, if you're not sure what a mediator is, I encourage you to have a look at the seminal work by Barron and Kenny from 1986. It is very detailed and it explains what a moderator is and what a mediator is. And I also have a separate video on this channel for mediator and a moderator. But for the purposes of this short video, I will try to explain you what a mediator means in the experiment. And I hope it will be very clear to you. If we try to understand the definition or the purpose of the mediator, which is something that exists between the independent variable and dependent variable, the easiest way to understand it that it is an underlying process. It is something that actually explains the effect of your stimuli, of your independent variable, on the outcome that you're actually measuring. And this underlying process is usually very internal to the organism or to the individual who is exposed to your stimuli. You may be wondering, what is the mediator all about? Visually, it looks kind of cool, something which is in between this bubble and this bubble. But you may still be wondering, what is this underlying process which is intrinsic to an organism all about? Well, it's something which is very simple. When we run an experiment in sociology, in psychology, social psychology, and marketing, which is my area of expertise, there is always something that would explain the effect of your intervention on the outcome that you're measuring. And if you are trying to understand what mediator is about, it could represent the underlying thought process. Now, you expose group 1 to advertisement 1, you expose group 2 in advertisement 2. If we actually take a marketing example, your control group doesn't see any advertisement. The mediator in this case would capture information processing. How much, for example, they like the advertisement. Another example could be brand personality. If one of these advertisements actually taps into a unique or very different brand personality or leverages it better, then if this brand personality appeals to them, then they are likely to purchase it. And in this case, your brand personality is the underlying thought process, is the underlying mediator, something that actually explains the impact of your stimuli on the dependent variable that you're measuring. Another example could be you run different social marketing campaigns targeting consumers' knowledge, and you are trying to see which of those interventions is actually more effective compared to no intervention, which is your control group. And you are trying to see which of them will result in greater knowledge. And the more consumers know about something, the more empowered they are, the more likely they are to engage in the behavior. So in this case, increase of the knowledge is the underlying process that explains how this intervention results in the outcome that you want to explain. Another example for mediator, let's say you design different advertisement. One of them is simpler, one of them is more complex. more visually busy, and you're trying to see how does that impact on processing fluency. Processing fluency is how hard or easy something is to cognitively process for consumers. So we're going into psychology a bit more in this marketing example. But if, for example, we say, okay, advertisement that is more complex reduces processing fluency, that makes them very upset. And that means that they're not going to purchase this brand, or they may like this brand less. So I hope after hearing these multiple examples of mediators that can exist in marketing, you now understand better what a mediator is. Very often when we investigate social phenomena or consumer phenomena, it's just not possible that there will be an impact of something and bam, there will be a behavior and outcome, because people process, they analyze information. So very often there has to be a mediator, and that mediator helps us explain the behavior. This is the beauty of marketing research. This is the beauty of psychology and social psychology, because we are trying to understand what is going on in the phenomena that we are studying. Because mediation captures the underlying process between how people process information and then how they behave, how they react, how they form their attitudes and beliefs. It is increasingly important in journal papers. And there are a number of editors in journals that actually say that they would like to see mediations in the papers that are submitted to their journals. For example, I have here a quote from the associate editor from the Journal of Experimental Social Psychology, Jamin Halberstadt, who said that he outright rejects manuscripts that do not have mediation. That makes sense, because we always want to understand why consumers do something, why individuals behave in the way they behave. So it makes sense that we would like to know what the underlying process is, what the actual mediation is. And that quote from Jamin Halberstadt comes from this journal paper, which was published in the Journal of Experimental Social Psychology. And there was another interesting quote there, which I really like, and it gives a really good definition of mediation. It says, it is exactly what research psychologists care about: locating causality, understanding what is going on. Now that you understand the importance of mediation and that it is frequently expected in a lot of academic papers, because we want to understand the underlying process that explains the impact of your experimental manipulation on the phenomenon that you're studying, you may be wondering, well, how do I actually know that this mediator, this factor, is the actual mediator between my intervention and the outcome that I'm measuring? This is the type of question that I always ask myself when I start investigating a new consumer phenomenon, because you always want to be sure that this is the actual thought process that goes through consumers' minds when you expose them to your experimental manipulation, and that it is what they are thinking about, rather than you forcing them to tick, 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 tick the responses to those scales and questions for the mediator that you are distributing after they've seen your advertisement, after they've been exposed to the experimental manipulations. And this question basically comes down to, how do you prove the presence of the mediator and that it's actually true? Well, the first answer is you have to do literature review. You have to see what was done in the past, and that should help you to understand what should be the mediator in the phenomenon that you study. It should help you contextualize your research better. If you're the first one to examine this, and there is no past literature to give you guidance, then there are several ways that you can approach this phenomenon. You can look at similar past behaviors that have been studied and try to make an analogy. Second, you can use that past literature, drawing analogies, and your amazing brains to explain what is actually going on as people are exposed to your experimental stimuli. Let me show you an example. And this example comes from the work which has been published in Journal of Marketing 2019. It's called A Cinderella Story: How Past Identity Salience Boosts Demand for Repurposed Products. And what the researchers were trying to show here is that when you look at upcycled products, and if that upcycled products actually tells a biographical story, what it used to be in the past, let's say an airbag, that should create a feeling of specialness in you and a consumer, which should stimulate greater purchase intention. So this was the thought process that the authors proposed for upcycle products. Mediators are usually measured quantitatively. In this case, you can use an existing scale, or you can adapt the past scale from a similar study, or you can develop your own measure. But please be careful with developing your own measures, because in academia, development of new measures and scales go through a slightly different process. They are separate papers on their own. There are several studies that need to be carried out, and there are also rules on how to do it. And you can have a look at it. I believe there was a very seminal paper published by Thürridl on the steps involved in developing and publishing new measures. So it's always better and safer for you to use an existing measure for your mediator, or use an existing scale and adapt it slightly to your research. So what can you do to prove that this is the real mediator, real thought process that goes through the consumer's minds when they see products' biographical story versus they don't see such a story? They simply see the description of the product. Well, if you read this paper, you will find that they use a very interesting approach. Authors use an existing measure for felt specialness, but they also administered open-ended questions after people were exposed to experimental manipulations. And in these open-ended questions, they asked them to describe their thought process. I think this is really nice approach to understand what is going on, because consumers would tell you what they felt, what they thought about when you were exposing them to different descriptions of the products. How did they actually go about analyzing their data? They coded the responses, because they ended up with a lot of qualitative entries. They looked at what was mentioned by the participants, then they coded them. They've identified several themes to tap into the thought processes that consumers were describing in this writing exercise. And then they used a chi-square test to analyze data relative to the manipulation. After you've done your coding and ran your chi-square test, if you observe that participants who were allocated to the first group, which is about product's biographical story, that they describe more thought processes or ideas, or mention more themes which tap into feeling special after purchasing of this product, or if they would purchase this product, compared to the people who are exposed to your second condition, which should not actually elicit such thought processes, then you establish the presence of the mediator. Of course, in this case, what would be good is that you provide a table with the examples of themes and codes, because reviewers would like to see them. People would like to know what they were. And I believe in their study, they did not statistically assess the link between the open-ended mediator and the dependent variable, because it's actually much harder to execute statistically. But that is okay, because here, when you do your coding of open-ended question, you establish that there are differences in thought processes between the people who were allocated to different groups. And that's exactly what you want as a researcher. Now, this is everything for the measurement of mediation experiment. I hope now you understand what is behind this very long and scary name. Behind it is a very simple idea that you have a mediator, some sort of a connecting link between your experimental manipulation and dependent variable. This is why here I have this nice visualization, and I hope that this visualization will help you to remember the purpose of this experiment in more detail.